All right, this is part 2 of 3-part video here, and this video we're actually going to we're going to enter Gethsemane. And the previous video left off with the analogy of the person that is drowning and the person that's a lifeguard that's there to save the person. And the power to be saved is beyond the person who is drowning, yet they have to cooperate in order to actually get out of the water in order to be saved. And that moves towards creating what Moser talks about in terms of volitional evidence for God, but that only works in the analogy, from the analogy that he's going to use of Jesus in Gethsemane. So here we're going to go back to our traveler, and we're going to enter the garden. And so in the garden, what exactly is going on? And first and foremost, we have to see that the garden was a historical location. It was a historical location of some event that truly and really did happen. And that event was what Moser calls deeply experiential and also volitional conflict. Jesus in conflict is what we see, and this is the idea. Here we have Paul Moser again, and we have our traveler saying, "What is Gethsemane?" We have these ideas formulating so far. What's going on? What is Gethsemane? And Moser, I think, would say something like this. This is what Moltmann calls our disturbing God. We have to remember the forsakenness of God. That it is a disturbing reality, and we have to keep that front and center at all times, because it's the single most unique thing, the cross and God forsakenness of Christ, and what that ultimately does for all of us in the gospel. And so, in this idea, there's a Moltmannian focus on aspects that make Jesus the most unique figure in all of history, that which leads to the crucified God, and also being abandoned by God on the cross. And so I want to read from Moser's own words. What is Gethsemane, and what's the point? And so before I get there, I want to also read a little section from Jürgen Moltmann. And he says that what's going on in the crucified God, it's no picnic garden. It's the context of human struggle with the presence of God's morally perfect character and will. And so when Moltmann says this, he's really in agreement with what Moser is trying to argue and conceive of. So we have to have essentially an understanding of what's going on between Jesus and the Father, what's going on in the relationship with God. Moltmann really focuses there, and Moser does as well. And entering the garden, Moser says, the reality of deep experiential and volitional conflict has a name and a historical location: Gethsemane. A deficiency of religious life and thought, including in Christian and Jewish variations, Moser agrees with Moltmann, is their failure to give due importance to Gethsemane and its disturbing God. In shunning Gethsemane, people become world-bound and thereby obscure any distinctive evidence of God in themselves. They can't conceive of something outside because they're starting so much from again, natural theology, things in creation, and trying to say God is simply another piece within creation to be studied. And that can't be done. Hence, the spiritual flatness, Moser says, among many humans, even religious communities. Indeed, we humans are experts at fleeing or otherwise avoiding Gethsemane. So Gethsemane is no picnic in the garden. It's a struggle with the presence of God's morally perfect character and will. And my apologies, Moltmann alludes to this, but this statement on 276 actually comes from Moser himself, I do believe. But Moser, Moltmann hints at this idea and definitely does talk about it. So Moser then moves on. The best example is Jesus of Nazareth in a place actually called Gethsemane. Bent on obeying God for the sake of introducing God's kingdom, Jesus found himself called by God to offer his life in self-sacrifice to God for the sake of others. This was moral struggle between Jesus and God, where Jesus anticipated his arrest and crucifixion by Roman officials as part of God's seemingly foolish plan of redemption. God invites and nudges people toward Gethsemane. They do not have to find it on their own. In other words, God has placed evidence that it's widely accessible. It's there, and that begins to help us move into an experience with God where we are opening ourselves to him in a Gethsemane type of experience. So Gethsemane then, Moser says, begins with the humanly experienced conflict between a human want and a divine want, but ends with the resolution, a human plea to God in favor of God's will. So the proper human approach to God likewise puts God's perfect will first, even when a serious human want must yield to God. We can find the God who hides, not in mere reflection, not in just thinking about it, but instead in the experiential and volitional conflict of Gethsemane, actually moving toward God in relationship, where God offers deep deliverance to humans, but on God's perfect terms. So what do we learn? We learn that we have to, again, approach God on God's terms, not ours, and that this requires transformation, even laying down a human want, a human desire, in order to place faith and to be delivered. So spiritual traveler says, how does this work out today? Why does this matter? And Moser says, by modeling Jesus, humans allow God's moral character, will, and reality to emerge in human experience in the manner that God desires. The evidence begins to emerge from direct access or experience of God in a morally transformative way. So before we move into a summary, Moser says Gethsemane is where humans should allow God's moral power to be apprehended, to be grabbed a hold of for what it is, divine rather than human. And so in a big summary, before we move to more of the idea of divine hiddenness in the third part of the video, just to see where our spiritual traveling friend has been, what he has learned so far. Again, Evan's natural sign idea is the starting point, I think. Sense perception of the world as being contingent leads beyond us, leads beyond humanity to open themselves to a divine being, to God. And so we should actually expect this, if God is good and worthy of worship, that he would want there to be evidence that is widely accessible to humanity. And so it's no coincidence that we find things in the world that we perceive of them as objects, and we then have a natural reflexivity and thought to go, why is there something instead of nothing? These are Evan's ideas that coincide and correspond with Moser in many, many ways. So we should expect that evidence for God is widely accessible, but also easily resistible. And here we again enter Moltmann and Moser, who say we have to approach God on God's terms, meaning opening ourselves to a God worthy of worship, to a good God who desires relationship directly with humans. And so, again, no coincidence that there's widely accessible evidence to say, why is there something and not nothing? And then that evidence then points us to a reality beyond creation, to that which created creation. ultimately to God, but it sort of doesn't get us there. Ultimately, we'll get to in just a second. But as humans open themselves to Gethsemane experience with God, moral transformation occurs as God draws near and as the human draws near. And so we can't just think our way into faith. That's part of it that leads to conceiving of something that's beyond us, that there is something instead of nothing, gives us an idea that there could be something beyond. But we actually have to open ourselves to God on God's terms in order to experience Him and have actual direct access, which, again, God desires, God wants. And this is consistent with what we should expect from a good God, that He would truly love people and not leave them in the state that they are in. In other words, love transforms to Christ likeness in direct communication between God and a human subject. God is always there. He's not some distant being who's not directly involved. A good God would desire to be involved in His creation, and not only be involved in it, but restore it, but want to bring His love upon it in an actual transformative way. But the problem still exists. Not everyone, we very quickly can think, but not everyone opens themselves or experiences evidence for God in the same type of way. So the question is, does this ruin God, since the evidence can be perceived as not compelling enough? In other words, it's easily resistible, and wouldn't a good God want to make that evidence so compelling that I had no choice but to believe? That's the objection that comes. It's ultimately put, it's not compelling enough because suffering still exists. And so in the next part, we will discuss this very idea. Does the fact that not everybody believes in the evidence for God that's widely accessible in creation, the fact that not everybody believes in that, does that ruin God because suffering still exists in the world and because many people resist it? And so, to be continued, the next video we will talk again about the idea of divine hiddenness and how we can leverage this idea of divine hiddenness, why God would hide and seek, and how that works in the realm of epistemology, how we can come to know truth, and perhaps more importantly, how we can potentially leverage that for doing apologetics, especially in terms of thinking about theodicy, questions and problems that surround the issue of suffering, evil in the world, and those types of things.